Welcome, everybody. That's the most important part. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening for a discussion on The Distance Cure, A History of Teletherapy by Hannah Zeavin, recently published by the MIT Press. My name is Molly Rogers, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for the Humanities at New York University. The center provides a forum at NYU for cross-disciplinary discussion and collaboration in the arts and humanities. And we do this in two ways. We do this through programs like working groups and faculty and doctoral fellowships. And we are currently accepting applications for these and other programs. So if you're part of the NY community, I invite you to visit our website to learn more. The second way in which we provide a forum for dialogue across the arts and humanities disciplines is through events like this one tonight. We host events almost on a weekly basis during the fall and spring semester. So if you don't already receive our newsletter, please visit our website to sign up. Before I introduce our discussants for this evening, I want to say that we will happily answer your questions from you tonight, or Hannah will happily answer your questions from the audience. Please feel free to send them to us anytime during the conversation. You don't have to wait until the end. When it occurs to you, you can just pop your question right in, but please use the Q&A button rather than chat so that we know we can find your question. So tonight's event on the history of teletherapy is a celebration of The Distance Cure by Hannah Zeavin, who, as it happens, was a fellow with the center in the 2017-18 academic year. And we're really delighted to welcome Hannah back for this event. Hannah Zeavin is a lecturer in the departments of English and History at the University of California. Additionally, she is a visiting fellow at the Columbia University Center for the Study of Social Difference. Zeavin's first book, The Distance Cure, A History of Teletherapy, is now out from MIT Press, and we're here to celebrate that book today. The Distance Cure has a foreword written by John Durham Peters. Hannah is currently working on her second book, Mother's Little Helpers, Technology in the American Family, also by MIT Press and due out in 2023. Other work of hers has appeared in or is forthcoming from American Imago, Differences, a journal of feminist cultural studies, The Guardian, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Real Life Magazine, Slate, The Washington Post, Logic Magazine, and others. Hannah will be in discussion this evening with Natasha Schüll, who is a cultural anthropologist and associate professor in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication here at NYU. Schüll's 2012 book, Addiction by Design, parses the intimate relationship between the experience of gambling addiction and casino industry design tactics, showing how architectural, atmospheric, ergonomic, audiovisual, and algorithmic computational techniques are marshaled to suspend and monetize gamblers' attention. Her current book project, Keeping Track, explores the rise of sensor-based digital technologies of the self and new modes of introspection, care, and self-regulation that they offer. Schüll's research and op-eds have been featured in 60 Minutes, The New York Times, The Economist, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The Financial Times, Salon, NPR, WGBH, and WNYC. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Natasha, who's going to moderate this evening's conversation. And thank you very much, Natasha.
Thank you, Molly, and Hannah for reaching out to me to be involved in this book launch at NYU, which is very exciting because I did read this a long time ago in earlier drafts, and it was so gratifying to come back to it. So greetings everyone who's with us here now or who may be watching it later. Just a word on format. So I will engage Hannah in questions about her book for about half an hour. And then we'll open up to any questions you might pose or post, and we'll moderate those. And I'm going to ask my questions. I have too many to actually ask, but I've selected among them in a way that more or less proceeds through the different chapters, which themselves follow a loosely chronological sort of sequence of moments, historical moments, in what Hannah calls teletherapy. So that should give you a good sense of the scope of this wonderful book, which I have here and which you should all acquire. So before starting, I guess I'll give an additional plug, not just to Hannah and the book, but to media culture and communication at NYU, which is the department where Hannah received her doctoral training. And I think it sort of shows up. There are traces of it in the way that Hannah brings a range of approaches, media studies, history, science and technology studies to bear on this particular inquiry, which is, her particular passion. And she does this as that inquiry sort of calls for those different approaches. So well done, Hannah, above all, and also well done, MCC, I think. So I guess since there may be people who haven't read the book or seen it, I'm just going to pluck out a quote on page 5 that I thought at a really sort of big general level tells what this book is about. Retelling the history of therapy as teletherapy allows us to examine contemporary fantasies, concerns, and panics about the impact of media on social and clinical relationships. So already she's sort of toggling from history to the present in this lovely way. And I wanted to start with a question on the very first chapter, which fittingly begins with Freud. And in that chapter, you make this compelling argument that sort of sets the stage for, or the frame, if you will, for the reader's encounter with the ensuing chapters, that therapeutic exchanges have been mediated from the get-go. And you point to various mediating elements, right? That to make this point, you mentioned money and the assigned roles and cultural expectations and seating arrangements and the sort of temporal boundaries of the timing and the rules of therapy. And I have 2 questions about what you don't do in that chapter that I would have expected, and it's not at all a criticism. I'm just thinking it's a way into hearing why you made these choices. Maybe you have thoughts on that. So the first thing, unless I missed it, it seems that you don't explicitly, it's implicit, but you don't explicitly name language itself as a medium. It's the main tool through which we relate to others in therapy. And it's also, like other media, by no means frictionless, and it frustrates and fails. And, Lacan would say it's the symbolic order we have to pass through to relate to each other. So certainly you could have gone on it at much greater length by highlighting and bringing out, that language itself is a medium. And I'm wondering what lay behind your choice not to do that.
Thanks so much. And there's so much already, even in the introduction. I'm like, yes, we can talk about the fact that this is definitely a kind of an illustration of a kind of MCC book, but just of which there are so many right now, so many great books coming out from people from MCC, either present or past. But this question, why not just start with language? So the book had this kind of complicated set of works to do, I felt. One was to try and take seriously the idea that all therapy is mediated from jump. So this is why the book is not The Distance Cure: A History of Mediated Therapy. And in fact, then it would have a different cute title. But I wanted to think about the distance specifically. So language, of course, is deeply operant, and there's a lot of theorization about what happens to language when it's put through various media regimes. And so the kind of medium specificity, whether that's early e-clinics or in Freud's own letters or whatnot. But there has been so much attention, not just in Lacanian psychoanalysis or Doradian theory, to the idea of language as media a priori, that it yet still hasn't attenuated the psychotherapeutic point of view that anyway it's pure. Right, that this is not actually a medium. So it's too bad, right? There are decades and decades of theorization that it is, and yet it hasn't been enough to suggest that therapy is always already mediated. So it's there, and actually it's in a lot of footnotes, like NC Lacan, NC Derrida, C Kittler, who we're making a small joke about before everyone joined. But I really wanted to do this communicative work about teletherapy specifically, and these first, that therapy is always in a triad: patient, at least one; therapist, at least one; and media, and that they're always there in addition to language, because it hadn't done enough to situate that as being true, though I agree with you, it is.
Yeah, I found it really refreshing. So the second question is similar, and you may have a similar answer to it, but I think it's useful to understand where you're coming from on this. So metaphor-wise, you talk about, you make this point about how therapy has been mediated from the get-go, in part by pointing to Freud's love for these kind of metaphors of media, and pointing to things like the telephone call, or even the writing pad, et cetera. But what you don't sort of, again, call out and put up front are this other set of metaphors, right, that he and others to this day elaborate on around the therapeutic exchange, which have to do with screens and canvases, right? And particularly like blank screens, blank canvases, as a way to sort of elaborate the therapeutically vital process of transference, and the fact that part of the job of the analyst is to cultivate themselves in this always necessarily imperfect way as a kind of blank canvas, so that therapy can work, which is partly the sitting, so you don't always see each other, right, in the couch setup of traditional psychoanalysis. So I suspect maybe the reasons you didn't decide to highlight that, you could answer similarly that there's been so much work, right, that people are still referring to and going through around screens and cinema and the gaze and looking. But certainly the gaze does have to do with distance. So I just wanted to hear you talk about that choice.
Yeah, I just wanted to get away from metaphors as quickly as possible. The book is about the real recruitment of technology and media for care. So with Freud, and it's there, it is well known, at least in media theory and psychoanalysis. Like, who knows what well known actually means? I don't know anymore, but it is well known in my fields that Freud loved to play with metaphor. And of course, there's screen memory. I mean, there's so many moments where various kinds of techno metaphor, media metaphor arrive and then stay. Really, it's deeply, and an earlier draft of this book really went for a kind of more killer argumentation about technophobic suppression, like why it's central. I mean, it's still there in the book, but why it's also so disavowed. And again, we could stay in the realm of language, and that is part of psychoanalytic theory and history and its own media. But I wanted to start thinking about these real moments of use as quickly as possible. And so for Freud, it may be well known that he liked to use metaphors of media, but he was also really using media to treat himself, to treat his friends' kids, and to treat patients for all kinds of reasons, because, and it feels eerily similar now because we've lived through and are living through this pandemic, which was not the case when I was writing the book. There would just be yet another national, international crisis in the middle of yet another analytic treatment, and Freud would switch back to the letter. And no one had really yet looked at that as a way of actually informing psychoanalytic practice, clinical practice. I think it also gets at this real question of what is, and I just want to say for folks who haven't read the book doesn't stay only with psychoanalysis. It kind of quite quickly moves on and then comes back. But, psychoanalytic work is theoretical, it's applied, and it's also a clinical practice. And I really wanted to be sitting as a historian of that last thing, the clinical practice, and bringing media theory there, as opposed to the other way around.
Okay, thank you. And just
thank you.
moving on to some of the other aspects of the book, in the second big chapter, which I'd heard you present about, and then encountering it here in the written page, learned so much more about telephone hotlines, right? And I guess Foucault, you talk about this yourself, has famously described psychoanalysis as a confessional technology. And, it's so interesting to read about the telephone hotline in light of that characterization, because as you point out, they're both a sort of even more exemplary remediation of sort of the confessional. And at the same time, they generate relational exchanges that are quite different from the confessional. So I just wanted to ask you to tell us about some of the similarities and differences with hotlines.
Yeah, and I love talking about the hotline chapter. So just in brief, again, I know that, first of all, who has time to read? And also the book is really new. The hotline chapter is called The Far Voice. It's a history of the suicide hotline, starting with the first extant one that we know of in the UK, and then very quickly moving to the US, where the second that we know of hotline exists in here in the Tenderloin district, which is just that way in San Francisco, where a kind of yoking of pastoral care from Christian traditions already being done on the phone, and a kind of psychoanalytically influenced sort of even hovering listening of Freud's metaphorization also comes into play. But it's also queered and it's radical because it's trying to cut off access to the LGBT community in San Francisco from both psychiatrists, where the DSM-3 has made quote unquote homosexuality diagnosis that can result in all kinds of carceral psychiatry, and also the police, where not only is homosexuality also illegal, but so is suicide. And so one thing that emerged out of writing this history is that teletherapy almost always attends, is elaborated in, innovated in around crisis. And in 1959, the Bay Area had the highest suicide rate anywhere in the world outside of West Berlin, which was undergoing the literal airlift at that moment. So, the hotline really focuses on what is kind of true about the confessional, but actually isn't, which is an idea of anonymity, right? People who go to churches in general, they're smaller, and it might be one of a few people who's going to take your confession. And so I've been told, of course, I'm Jewish and have never gotten the chance to go to confession, but you kind of know to whom you're confessing. And it's not supposed to totally matter because it's an intercessor to God, and it does matter. And same, there are going to be 200 parishioners, but your voice, if you're practicing regularly, is going to be known. So I tried to think about this idea of anonymity, both as being a protective factor on the hotline, one that we continue to use to today on suicide hotlines, but also always being negotiated. So what kinds of protective factors are being carried by total anonymity, pseudo-anonymity on this dialogic medium, the phone, right? Where all of the volunteers who, especially in the Bay Area context, were people with zero psychiatric or social work training, they were rejected by the person establishing the hotline, so as to, again, keep psychiatry and keep policing out of it. They had to be instructed how to not make the phone call like a phone call. And that really fascinated me. So whereas Freud is like, it's like a phone call, he's totally wrong, right? And people actually working with the phone as the medium of care knew that. Yeah, and there's so much more to say, but I won't.
Yeah, I mean, let's for the record definitely say that in addition to the anonymity, there's also this sort of radical or definitely beyond confessional power dynamic shift, so that the expert authority is demoted, right? And the caller has agency, which was something that really came to the fore in that chapter. And I think that's where you develop this great idea of distanced intimacy. So then the next chapter moves from the dialogical to wide broadcast. And there you're talking about radio, television, these kind of spectacular enactments of therapeutic exchanges is what you're choosing to look at, rather than something like, reality TV. Many of us, I at least am familiar with Esther Perel's podcasts and the wonderful, tell me her last name, Orna. Yes, Grolic, the couples therapy show, which was sort of going on during the pandemic in part. But the backstory here, these sort of historical precursors to these forms of kind of public couples therapy or therapy in general is so fascinating. And I wanted to invite you to tell a couple of those stories.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, this chapter is definitely, in a way, it's the weirdest chapter in the book. It's called Mass Intimacy. So as you just said, Natasha, right there, the book is trying to think through medium-specific genres of intimacy that are convened not just in the therapeutic relationship, but then, of course, because the therapeutic relationship is extraordinary, is virtual, which is one of the metaphors I do play with a lot, is a kind of as if fantastical imagining and reimagining of relationality as such, right? That's one of the goals of therapy, some therapies. I think the better therapies, right? That they're liberatory precisely because they're allowing for a kind of re-holding, re-relating. Therapy also, therefore, provides a really, and teletherapy specifically, important aperture for me onto relationality as such, how we do relating remotely. So with mass intimacy, the cases here happen to be about these very specific therapeutic broadcasts, but it's very interrelated to the kinds of group that are convened elsewhere and otherwise. It starts with another crisis, the Blitz in World War II, where, too familiar now, I know, no one could go meet each other, right? Not because of a plague, but because of bombs from the skies. And so there are all these ways that psychoanalysts needed to reconfigure the frame so that the work could go on. So it starts with the BBC broadcasts from many psychoanalysts, including the big famous ones, Winnicott, Klein. Then there's a kind of historical shift to think about Fanon's radical experiments and theorizations with the radio in Algeria, and Guattari's also, again, radical psychiatric experiments with free radio, where we can really start to see that there was a long tradition of left psychoanalysis thinking about how to harness utility. It's the same as the phone, something that's going to be in the home anyway for these modes of care that are, again, going to be liberatory rather than re-inflicting many of the power dynamics, many of the violences that psychiatric care carries with it, no doubt. To maybe not the best use of the radio in the history of the world. Pretty punishing backlash to second wave feminist radio shows, Stick With Your Man. These are the ways to relate. These are the ways for proper white femininity to look and be constructed. I'm thinking of Dr. Laura. If anyone also happened to hear those talk radio shows in the 80s and 90s, they're still, thank God for the Internet Archive, they're still archived. Always have to plug the Internet Archive. To Esther Perel and Orna Goralnik. And one thing that emerges, right, is this kind of reconstruction of what is the proper family, following the work of many scholars who work on radio, this kind of, whether it's imagined community or the sort of ties that bind to remake the family, or the nation state. These are the kinds of major concerns of that chapter, Mass Intimacy.
Okay, so listeners who aren't familiar with the book yet are getting a sense of the many places this book goes. It has so much in it, yet manages to feel like you are just on track with this story, and each piece is contributing to that story. So it's really remarkable how many different things are in here without it feeling scattered. For me, in my reading experience, I experienced the most gratification, perhaps because it comes closest to my own research interests in the auto-intimacy chapter. So certainly, you can put it in your own words, but I took this idea of auto-intimacy to be this closed circuit of self that kind of runs through or is routed through a media, right? And it doesn't necessarily admit or isn't designed to admit other live human beings. And so I guess I'm just going to step aside and say that one of the things I appreciated in general about your analysis throughout the book was the way that you finesse extrapolation and dehomogenization. In other words, like to put it in simpler terms, the way that you're at once working to discern common characteristics across a range of these different mediated encounters, some of which you've taken us through here, that fall under this heading of telepathy, right? But you don't sorry, I did it.
It's my goal to make every single interlocutor of mine make that Freudian slip.
Yeah, and I promise it wasn't a plant. I did it honestly. That was an honest slip. So under this heading of teletherapy, right? But you're not turning teletherapy into a monolith of any kind. And that's where you do the work of dehomogenizing. So you are specifying types of teletherapy and even like specific affordances and constraints, to use sort of media studies language, within these types of mediated exchanges. So that absolutely comes to the fore brilliantly in this auto-intimacy chapter, where you manage to describe a whole set of different kind of apps, both historical and contemporary, that are configured differently, right? So they have these really significant, even you could say existentially, ethically significant differences across them, but are all under that heading of, auto-intimacy sort of apps. So take us through some of those.
Sure, thank you. And the reason it was exciting to hear Natasha say telepathy is because there's also there's an Easter egg in the book, which I can spoil for you by telling you about it if you haven't read it yet, which is that telepathy keeps coming up like I couldn't have planned it in every single case as the kind of litmus test for and against teletherapy. So that chapter begins with Turing thinking about telepathy. Also because it turns out that therapy becomes part of the Turing test across the 20th century and into our present, even though we've sort of stepped away from the Turing test as a marker, where as long as we've had work on AI, we've been trying to also make an AI therapist. And when AI therapists succeed at all, it's in relation to this idea of having passed the Turing test, which I just find really strange and marvelous. And I think it's because of what I said earlier, where therapy, though an extraordinary and specific relationship, gives on to ordinary communication, precisely because it's a kind of virtual version of what we all do all the time. So that chapter starts in the wild heyday of Timothy Leary and friends after I deal with Turing, where these two brothers who are amazing, Charles and Warner Slack. Charles is working at Harvard, like ostensibly very high on acid, in the same moment as Skinner, to make a jerry-rigged tape recorder that's going to record, I'd be doing a good job of it right now, record the ticks of someone's speech so that the higher the tally goes, the more clicks they get, and then they're paid according to how high their tally goes. So he makes a kind of gamified device that the more you talk, the more you get paid, the higher the tally goes. And it turned out, and this is what he was trying to ascertain, the better people felt. They didn't actually need a human other to feel better for speaking. And this is also the joke and stereotype of the Freudian analyst, that essentially they're the occasioning, convening, completely silent figure who just says, go on, tell me more about that. And so across the 20th century, we see different ways of trying to produce that entrainment and that capitulation into speaking where instead of it being an analyst, it's a non-human other. So cash, a kind of linguistic entrainment in the case of Eliza, the most famous, written about, dare I say, overwritten about, I had to do it too, device in the history of sort of AI and therapy, falling very much in the Sherry Turkle, Elizabeth Wilson, Lydia Liu kind of mode, through to really our contemporary, where after the book was finished, this was the summer, it was about to come out, these apps are now receiving hundreds of millions of dollars in B series funding, where this is pointed to as the kind of future of mental health care, that people don't need the therapist, they just need themselves. And I try and theorize what that and is, which is what I call auto intimacy, a kind of essentially self-soothing and exploration of the self that doesn't require the explicit human other, though of course there are humans doing all kinds of labor in tech, which I say is like thumb sucking or writing in a diary, but has these particular, genres of intimacy called out of the user, who used to be called a patient and now no longer is.
Right. In that, there's so much in there, right? And we really can't cover it all. I'm glad you touched on some of the historical examples, because we are all so exposed to the other kinds of examples that are out there, whether it's Headspace or some online diary writing, etc. But what I appreciated was that you leave room for some criticism. You were able very articulately to kind of navigate these descriptions and say, to put it bluntly, like, this is sad and bad, and these other things maybe we should recuperate, and like that there's a difference here. I appreciated this, especially given that I'm now coming to see my first and second book as two sides to the same coin. And if in my first book, I was writing about gambling addicts, right, who escape into this sort of zone where they almost describe merging with the machine in this very telepathic, they think what the machine thinks, it knows what they are thinking, to self-tracking technologies, right? Which both of those are forms of auto intimacy, but the self-tracking technologies are designed in a way that is less tightly configured, as you described in some of what you're looking at, that allows more breathing room, possibilities, etc. So you are not dismissing out of hand. You say that very clearly about, teletherapy in general, that your goal is neither to dismiss nor to embrace, right? Now I'm looking at the time. I want to make sure to get some questions. So I do want to ask one more though. And this is the kind of pandemic question. I made a real effort to not bring that up at the beginning, even though it inevitably came up. I see it as the kind of elephant in the room, or the elephant in the Zoom, as it were. So I couldn't resist.
I haven't heard that one. That's
yeah.
Good. Yeah.
So, I know that this book was written before it was written pre-pandemic, but you were finishing it. You wrote the coda directly addressing the pandemic, and I'm glad you had the chance to do that, because it's so it illuminates the things going on in the pandemic, and the pandemic sort of makes so much more salient some of the arguments that you and themes that you're developing. So I guess my question is just there's two questions, and you can choose to both or one of them. One question is, just to take the focus off the COVID pandemic we all know all too well, there are these other moments of collective crisis precursor stories. You've told us, you've mentioned the Blitz, et cetera, that help put our own sort of disruption of relationality into perspective, which is really useful. But the question I really want to get to is, what can you say you were surprised by post-pandemic? Things that surprised you either because they made some of your more suggestive tentative arguments feel really more solid and true, right? Or maybe undermine and shift your arguments, or raise totally new issues. So what did it look like, you rereading your manuscript after all this was happening?
Thanks. Yeah. So, I mean, I wrote the entire book minus this coda, which is called When Distance is Everywhere. It was done. It was under review, and I got a contract from MIT as the pandemic started, which meant I was able to just like add this coda. The coda is dated from last June. I had like 2.5 months to sit in the pandemic. So I've written a lot afterwards about what happened next. And like maybe in 50 years, if I'm still alive, like the robots at MIT who have taken over will let me add some of that into a new coda or something. But in this book, I think, one thing that did surprise me was the playbook, right? Which was that, yep, the second it becomes impossible for whatever reason for people to meet together, people also are in crisis and they want the work. And in fact, more people want the work. And suddenly there's a crisis that and I write about why this is throughout the book, depending on where and when. We've been living in, an ongoing crisis of care since Freud failed to fully situate his free clinics for psychoanalysis, that would be in Europe, and since World War I, at least in the US, meaning definitely longer. And in terms of professional psychology since then. And so in a way, I really hesitate around the pandemic showed us, right, what had already been the case. And it was, for some people, I think that's true. For me, it was really exciting to feel like people wanted to help no matter what. And so they bracketed these more technophobic suspicions of Zoom, even as they started to complain about it. So the minute that the pandemic seemed to be a week in, people are complaining about Zoom fatigue. I mean, therapists that I was interviewing. And that was really interesting to me because I had this longstanding argument that the screen is a screen, that in fact, screens carry what is in the human. And one thing they carry is alienation, loneliness, despair, these long, complicated, different terms for kind of human suffering, which I talk about in the book. And that seemed to be the case again, focused on a kind of labor fatigue instead of a kind of technophobic suppression. And it also allowed me to think about why patients don't like Zoom or don't like other media, because in the earlier cases, this kind of patients don't like it thing was never coming up, right? People who called the hotline were calling the hotline because they were going to call the hotline. It was the only thing that was going to work. Now, suddenly people really had a sort of sense of, well, I would rather not be in treatment than be on Zoom, or the second it's safe to do so, I want to go back. Other people, of course, had the opposite experience and still haven't gone back, therapists and patients alike. So I was able to think about nothing tentative from the book in its interior, but at the end, and kind of new theory that I hope to expand on. It's not related to my second project, so it just have to be a standalone article called The Medium Inside, which is very much drawing on Fanon's ideas around what the medium is doing in the war in Algeria, and that in fact, the medium doesn't have to be any good. In fact, the medium's noise, which we so greatly devalue, often can actually be its signal or what becomes signal. So I was trying to think about the psychological implications of Zoom fatigue, or the fact that, Natasha, at any minute this call could drop because one of our internets goes out, and it'll be weird, if not experienced as terrible, or one of us could glitch in a terrible way, and trying to think about those problems in the medium as actually letting us do a different kind of psychological work. So that was interesting. And that people were doing broadcasts again, letters, right? People are shifting to email because they didn't want to talk out loud. The whole playbook was in evidence. Yeah, those two things.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the reasons that I brought up screens earlier is because I had Zoom on the brain, and maybe you talked about this and I missed it, but one of the things that is so weird and maybe in some ways would have seemed to thwart the kind of relationality of traditional analysis or therapy is that patients are, unless they like fiddle around with the technology, they're essentially looking at themselves in a mirror, whether that little self face is hovering as it is over here in the upper right of my screen right now, or, you know, sitting side by side in a gallery view. And it just made me think all sorts of things about, you know, mirror stages and this uncanny coherence of the sort of image of the self that we are presented with. So I was thinking much more in terms of looking and seeing, and these are new problematics around that than noise and hearing. And maybe, who knows, I'd love to know more about why patients say they don't like it. And seems to me like more therapists maybe do than the patients. And it's just all so interesting. I really hope that you find a way, even if it's in blog posts, to write more about these specifics.
I just want to though talk about the looking at oneself. It was something that in an interview I had to cut from the book, because one thing that happened with the auto intimacy chapter is that, I don't know if you had this experience with the second book, Natasha. So many companies went bankrupt between 2016 and 2020. And I wrote a little bit about that, but no one wants to read like, and this one went bankrupt, and then beyond that, you make that point. So one of the fascinations from the e-therapy chapter, which goes from 1980s to the present, were these like a kind of, the company was called Everbliss, which is a terrible name for a company. But it was like a kind of Talkspace-esque startup. They talked about how they were worried that everyone would just be looking at themselves in 2016 as an interference. So I think what they tried to do is make a sort of platform that disappeared the person's image. And then they realized you can still see your face in the reflective glass of the iPhone. So they couldn't get rid of it. They couldn't get rid of it. And so many patients and therapists that I interviewed for the end of the book, for the coda, they all said they had gotten rid of it. Almost all, not everyone, but a huge preponderance had dealt with that setting so that they weren't just like looking over here at themselves, checking there. So I think people were trying to get creative and customizing what that experience would be like. At the same time as people also really played with being able to look at themselves differently or be seen differently. So clinical stories that people shared with me of patients who would just like stand over the Zoom, you know, loom over their therapist, but at a distance, or, you know, really controls that you could never see below the neck, and entire pregnancies passed and the therapist never knew. So various things like this, really recontrol, which reminded me also of the hotline, like this kind of seating back. Yeah, we can talk.
Yeah,
more.
whatever I guess the patient needs to feel held in that weird new Zoom space.
Or like sadistic, right? It's not psychoanalysis and attended psychotherapy. It's not all like Winnicott reholding, you know, there's a lot going on there.
Right. And it does afford these new, it affords like a new, or it remediates all sorts of, as you say in the book, droppings, right? And other kinds of failures, freezings, where you still hear a voice, but a face is frozen. And all of these are, you know, really uncanny. You know, they come out of left field, and you are left having to sit and abide the discomforts or frustrations that you may feel. So this is the friction, right? The friction that pops onto the scene. So speaking of all of that, I see I'm going to ask Molly to send me any questions. Okay, cool. So here is one. And thank you, Molly, for posting the link to purchase this book, which everyone can find in the chat. I'd like to know more about Hannah's sources. Sounds like interviews and archives, but how does one research a complex topic like this? So maybe that could bring us full circle back to both of us talking about your approach, you know, this kind of MCC approach. How did you put your archive together? What were your methods?
Yeah, thank you for who, I don't know who asked the question, but thank you. It's a great question. So yeah, I mean, the book makes you, the problem, and I write about this in the book, I left in a note on method. I condensed and condensed and condensed, but I felt like I had to leave in a note about the method, which is to say that on the one hand, teletherapy is, and the history of it was very much a kind of information science project. And sometimes there'd be no records, and sometimes there'd be too many records, sensitive records. So yes, there were some very well organized archives, like the Library of Congress holds Freud's archive. There were oral histories with the child patient Freud did teletherapy with. Great, awesome. I had to go to some sort of various religious archives, social services archives for the Hotline chapter, an admixture of psychiatric and social service archives for, you know, the mass intimacy radio chapter. Starting in the sort of like last third of the book, everything is a quote unquote born digital archive at a certain point. So I had to fill in the gaps, which meant doing a lot of original oral history. So timing was both on my side and not. Bernard Mays, the founder of the Queer Suicide Hotline I was talking about, died 2 weeks before I started working on that chapter. Or Warner Slack, who I mentioned, died right after I interviewed him, which was really sad. And his work is amazing, not just in the early period, but he worked on telemedicine until he died. He was at Harvard. So there's a lot of that, but really also working to unsee stuff, right? I won't name the archive, I won't name the psychoanalyst, but I got access to a series of psychoanalytic case books that definitely had patient names of very famous case studies where I shouldn't have seen them for another 50 years, and had to just forget what I had seen because it's not something I should have seen. So there was a lot of kind of doing different sort of discourse analysis, but deep archival work, oral history, and also misremembering, disremembering, you know, suicide hotline logs and things like this too.
So following on that, we have another question that is about the sort of geographic scope of this project. And it begins in Vienna, and then you kind of follow your object of teletherapy across these different iterations. So the question is, you've mentioned both the UK and the US. So to what extent would you say that this is or isn't a global history?
Yeah, I would say it's more a transnational American studies book. So we have work in France, Italy, Algeria, a little bit of Australia, because the Samaritans who are in the UK also show up there. We're Hotlines again. So the book is about teletherapy as the shadow form of therapy up until the pandemic now, where it's the major, if not only form. And then it really becomes a US centered story. I was trained in American studies and didn't, so make a focus there and make a claim about that in the opening of the book, which is to say that it's not some kind of global media study, that there's other work that has been done and should be done on those histories, but wanted to look at especially the way the story ends or has ended or is ending now, which is a very Americanist, neoliberal wellness kind of picture that I trace back to the 1930s, to the 1920s and 30s around the Depression, and a kind of Norman Vincent Peale, Smiley Blanton, the power of positive thinking into cognitive behavioral therapy, into wellness. That is so much about the kind of automation of care and the push to batch process patients. And again, from the geographic region in which I'm trained, felt important again. So as Natasha said, to be specific, and yet it's still very much a transnational story, especially in its origin.
Yeah, and as an anthropologist, I know of a couple of great ethnographies. One is in Russia, one is in China, that talk about radio broadcast and these sort of historical moments of a new kind of self-cultivation, and what role did these kind of mediated therapies, very often of the broadcast form, play in that. But I'm glad you just brought up the apps again and wellness, because I did want you to talk about wellness a little bit more, and the problem that you have with that, specifically with digital wellness, and what that all entails.
Where
getting back to like the bad and the sad.
Yeah. I was nervous, but I've been calmed. I got, the first half of the book, there are moments like, again, Dr. Laura, where it's clear I'm not like a mega fan or something. But I really love so much of the work and the hotline, although also, there are evangelical hotlines that are completely pernicious. They also talk about, I got scared that I could be misread as like also being evangelical for teletherapy, but it hasn't happened. And I'm glad about that the bad and the sad do that work clearly. There's a lot to say about wellness as a kind of softening of what is the therapeutic. Not that the therapeutic itself is always a good thing, it's not. But definitely moving care away from a kind of relational offering to something that one can do for oneself, a co-opting of a radical Black feminist tradition around self-care, put onto a kind of expedited 5 minutes, let's take our 5 minutes to go get Calm TM on the Calm app, as a kind of reminder that workers need to be fit for doing something, which is work, and that our employers, if we have them, would like us to be fit enough to continue to do work without breakdown. And that's the instrumentalization of wellness now. That, or, a very, very classed phenomenon of, but this is not what my book is about, right? Of taking adaptogens and this kind of thing. Again, also an appropriative move. But the book is really focused on that turn to harnessing gamified, pleasurable auto-intimacy for the sake of the worker, the laborer, getting better enough to go back to the crisis that work is. Again and again and again. And it's really part of the story that starts at the beginning, which is that we've had across the last, again, 100 years at least, a notion of a therapeutic labor shortage. Like any other labor shortage, it's not one, it's something else, right? But it's called that. And we've had to batch process patients ever since. There are not enough therapists for patients.
But it's also right about the scalability logic. So, even if there were not enough according to the current logic of scalability, where you can't get venture funding for anything unless you can show how it immediately.
Certainly not.
Right?
Yeah, certainly not. No, if we're staying in the app space, that's a result of it. I get asked a lot when I do media, like, so who's doing it well, Hannah? Or someone will be like, but what would you tell these corporate apps to do? And I'm like, there's no way to intervene into, they're corporate apps, nothing I would say, because it's all, of course, about scalability, profit motive, partnering with cities to get, major contracts that then no one makes use of. That's been the trajectory of these apps for sure. Yeah, right. It is the sad and the bad of the book.
But certainly, to kind of wrap up on a more positive note, you're very articulate in the book. I don't at all read this as boosterism for teletherapy. It definitely comes across when you are moved in certain instances, particularly around the hotlines at these pretty amazing things that happen. The suicide rate went down by half. That's amazing. You don't come out quite so readily and point out, and you say just now that you're reluctant to, right? When the question gets posed in a certain way, like how should these be designed, right? You resist going that way, but I do think that embedded in here are certain suggestions about what we might recuperate, repurpose, apply, that if we're thinking about the app algorithm space that is all around us today, that our world is saturated with, we could just say, oh, it's all bad and sad, or try to do that dehomogenizing and point. And here, I'm just going to go out on a limb and suggest that when people ask you that, you're put in a similar position as the so-called whistleblower Frances Haugen with Facebook, right? Who points at once to very specific things on Facebook that she thinks should sorting algorithms that could be sorted according to different criteria, so as to enable breathing space flourishing that wouldn't so quickly short circuit and gamify. But like you, she then says, we can have that conversation, but we are all at this company looking at the graphs and trying to make the profit line kind of go up. So, I hear you when you say, like, that's the really fundamental thing that needs changing. But what are some,
Yeah, I mean, there are a few things that, one is that the appification of mental health care is not just in the Silicon Valley corporate world. I write about this at the conclusion. It's also in the nonprofit space, I guess that's the term. And one thing, so again, yes, I am moved by some of the hotlines I write about that are extant still. But the hotline, right, as I said, is set up as this pretty radical peer-to-peer way of doing mental health care that's anti-carceral and anti-psychiatric. It's not anti-therapeutic, but it's anti-psychiatric. And those, now contemporary hotlines are super datafied. They often make use of geolocation. They don't have to legally, and they often instrumentalize the police to do quote unquote wellness checks, which is another side of wellness, which we've seen, ends in uneven or racialized tragedy and death. So a suicide hotline call now can turn fatal. And 50 years ago, not possible. Technology has changed. It literally wasn't possible. That's why the phone made sense. It's part of why the phone was chosen. So I think that that's something that I, often say, that when there is a human on the other end of the line, to also make a kind of recourse to policing, which was always the idea about this kind of care, was that was made impossible. Let's go back there. And very few hotlines still have that as their core. So the Trans Lifeline, it's still one of their core principles. And I see them as really having moved out of that, that tradition, and they hold that lineage. Also, like, pay therapists a lot better. That would be one. So I write a lot about therapeutic labor, and am in conversation with scholars like Elizabeth Cotton, who's in the UK, who writes quote unquote surviving work about the gigification and Uberification of mental health care, where these apps pay therapists 20 or 30 bucks an hour. And that means for 2 sessions, because they're doing 30-minute sessions, and they have a whole caseload on text on top of voiced sessions. That's a problem that is only going to escalate. So 10% of UK mental health care workers last year made $0. Again, no labor shortage. Something else is happening. Those would be my 2 things. Don't call the police, and pay therapists better as a start.
Right. And it occurs to me, just as a note, since we are having this conversation on a virtual college campus, you could say that so much of what's in your book could inform conversations around the domain of pedagogy and learning, and what adjunct laborers get paid, and the sort of privatization and appification, and certainly gamification of education. So I really see this book as not only this rich collection of historical cases and examples that are set by you so in such a lovely way along an argumentative line, but it's also bears upon so many other contemporary domains. So it's really a rich work. And I feel like that, I guess I'll just invite you, if there's anything we haven't touched upon that you feel like needs to be said before we wrap up.
We've gone so many places. You are like so great at, you're like A to C or D or whatever. And then there's one question in the chat from Amanda Palmer, wondering if there are ways that institutions undergirding these interpersonal relations via media show up in the book. And I just like, if Amanda wants that question answered, I just love a little clarification by what's meant by the institutions. I'm not sure I'm understanding it. Unless
and that is so interesting because I don't see that in my chat. So you may have a different chat.
And in my chat also, Risa just complimented you, Natasha. The interviewer was also excellent. So in case
I have a very limited chat, maybe I can see it afterwards, or people are writing directly to you. But yeah, certainly if you see questions in your chat that I have overlooked because I didn't see them, then please.
No, I just wanted to make sure Amanda got their question answered, but also, I mean, there are institutions throughout this book. The one thing we didn't touch on, but was raised between Amanda's question and your remark about education, is about the way that colleges meet with suicidality in the 1980s to try and think about the early internet as a space of care, where stymied again. And this was Ben Kafka's intuition when I talked to him about the book early. He was like, you got to go dig in, what are they called? The legal databases, to see how suicide is working there. And it turns out that because of distance and state licensure and liability, there are all these worries about moving mental health care online that still to today dominate. So another thing that we're going to see, I think, in the next year coming out of the pandemic, and scare quotes, is going to be this question of who can practice what kinds of mental health care, where, when. Are we going to get a national licensure instead of state by state? So universities are one of those institutions that keep popping up because there is a vulnerable population under their care. But again, with teletherapy, the thing that I saw again and again is that there's a huge rejection of the institution as part of it. So yes, we have Cornell University plays a role in the story, the BBC, and huge corporations towards the end. But otherwise, it's much more a kind of community-based, institution-free activist story up until our contemporary moment, where it certainly is not. But that's a great question, Amanda.
I do think that Amanda maybe is or has been a TA, right? A graduate TA for undergrads, and part of the new training or in these new NYU systems that are themselves, I think, from the perspective of the student users, gamified to some extent, and that are around wellness centers, and you can sort of check in and give kudos and points and flags, as a way to sort of draw students in who might need it, et cetera. So the university certainly is a domain, not thinking just about pedagogy and learning and how technology mediates that, but how the student body's mental health is mediated. So I'm glad we touched on that.
Yeah, it's here too, also at UC Berkeley.
So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And I hope everybody who's on this call or who watches it later picks up a copy. Again, here's the book, The Distance Cure, A History of Teletherapy, not to be confused with telepathy.
No, it has that history too. And thank you so much, Natasha and Molly, and for having me back at the NYU Humanities Center. It was crucial to the completion of this work to be a fellow. And for those who are listening, please apply to be a fellow. It was such a wonderful experience.
Thank you both. This was a fantastic conversation and about a really terrific book. So we were glad to play a part back then, and we're very, very happy to provide a platform now for your work. Thank you, Natasha. Yes, the one of the audience members did applaud you for your excellent questioning and moderating. Thank you, Hannah, for really sort of clear, wonderfully interesting answers to all the questions. I also want to thank Kyla Bowen and Denny Valentine, who work behind the scenes with me here at the center. And lastly, I want to thank the audience for joining us. This was a great event. Have a lovely evening, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone.